Good afternoon. My name is Martin Palouš. I'm director of Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy at Florida International University. And this is part of our project called Ideas for Cuba. We do together with Inspire America Foundation. And the idea of Ideas for Cuba is to help opening debates about important themes that are related to the Cuban present situation, but also to Cuban future. And we believe that is also present. It's present in history of individuals exposed to Cuban history. It's present in their knowledge and conclusions or their visions based on what they experienced in the past.
Svobodomyslným lidem či hlasitě promlouvajícím svědkům poměrů v Severní Koreji, Barmě, Iránu, Tibetu, Bělorusku, na Kubě či kdekoliv jinde může naše podpora pomoci víc, než si myslíme.
That was President Havel's great contribution.
Ale pomůže i nám. Pomůže nám připravovat lepší svět a zároveň být lépe sami sebou, totiž lépe naplňovat konkrétním obsahem hodnoty, k nimž se v obecné rovině hlásíme.
I think Cuba needs the present. Cuba needs something for Cubans now. Cuba needs a debate about a new history, a good history.
I think that young generations are also very sensitive to the cruelty of communism. But they need to know that communism is not a problem of the past. It's still a threat in the present.
Our political philosophy is representative democracy and social justice in a well-planned economy.
I was fighting, and we were collaborating with the 26th of July in different areas. And I think when we were deceived by Fidel Castro, we were betrayed by Fidel Castro.
The European experience at the fall of communism in 1989 with the challenges Cubans and now Venezuelans have in 2018. So this is the theme for our today's conversation. We have a great panel gathered. Orlando Gutierrez is director of Directorio Democrático Cubano, Cuban-American philosopher and thinker. We have here Maria Verlau, director of Cuban Archive, and another, I would say, wise and articulate observer of Cuban realities. We have here Pedro Fuentesit, former political prisoner and colleague of mine because we are working together in an entity called International Platform for Human Rights in Cuba. He's an old man, but still a young soul, and someone who really can well represent the Cuban case. And I can just testify to make my own testimony when we go around the world and trying to send the right message. Miguel Cosio, my new acquaintance, he is a distinguished Cuban-American journalist operating in Miami. He's CEO or important person in American TV, and he is, as I've said, one of the members of board of directors of Inspire America Foundation. I have to say with regret that my colleague convener, Marcel Felipe, for urgent reasons, could not be present with us in that moment, but he sent us a video that I think is clearly sending the message I also share with him. So please, Marcel Felipe, now.
Good afternoon. The Inspire America Foundation is pleased to co-sponsor the Ideas for Cuba project with Florida International University's the Howell Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, Columbia University, the Czech Foreign Ministry, the Howell Library, and the state of Florida. Today, we've been asked to discuss a very simple concept, the title of Ambassador Palau's new book, The Presence of the Past. Somewhat poetic, but very, very telling. The past is very much part of our present. It shapes who we are, it shapes our views, and it shapes what we do next. Our present, however, will soon be the past, and it will shape the views and actions of future generations. It is therefore a great responsibility for those who venture out into the civic world to make sure that as we implement our actions, our policies, our ideas, we are careful to learn from the mistakes of the past and to be true to the principles of the past so that we could pass those on to the future. In Cuba's case, we are particularly lucky. Our country wasn't simply founded by a military leader. It was founded by someone who was an intellectual, a poet, a thinker. This person's views and philosophy are taught to every Cuban children, both during the Democratic Republic and now during the communist darkness. His views, José Martí's views, are quite simple. Todo ser humano tiene el derecho de pensar y hablar sin hipocresía. Every human being has the right to think and speak without hypocrisy. The individual is the center of society. The state is created for the purpose of protecting the individual's rights. The majority cannot take them away. If we're true to those principles, to that guiding light, we will never fall astray to dictatorships again. We will never fall astray to the rule of a mob majority. It doesn't matter what the majority thinks. That's important only for purposes of orderly carrying out the state's business. But what's truly crucial is that individual rights are protected. If we carry that with us and we learn from our mistakes over the last 60 years, I think we will build a lasting future. Cuba today is at a crossroads like it hasn't been at least in 30 years. Government is at its weakest point. The possibility of change is now closer than it has been since the General Ochoa days. What we do will mark a new generation. I hope we do it well. Thank you, and I hope to listen to all of the experts who have been gathered here today. people who we truly respect and admire for their courageous voices and their particular insight into the Cuban mind. What's ahead? The presence of the past.
Thank you very much, Marcel. And now let's go to our discussion. You may know that we have been busy, Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, in this topic for some time. We have a cooperation with Czech-based foundation called Postbellum that is specialized in bringing together stories of individuals exposed in one way or another to totalitarianism of the 20th century. And for 3 years already, we have been trying to bring into mostly European collection Cuban contributions. And we last year published a collected volume with the name The Presence of the Past. And I'm very happy that we have two authors, two contributors to this book here with us. So I will start with them, and then I will ask other two panelists to comment. So first I would like Orlando Gutierrez to step in with his vision of Cuban memory. What Cuban memory is for you, Orlando?
If you look at Cuban history and you divide Cuban history into, or Cuban history has traditionally been divided into 4 phases: the colony, the period of the wars of independence, the first Criollo Republic between 1902 and 1959, and then communist totalitarianism. I think there are 3 themes which are recurrent in these 4 periods, and which are the poles. They're the main factors of Cuban national identity, and the memory that underlies that identity tends to fall into this matrix. I think these 3 main aspects of Cuban national identity, which have been the center of the drama of Cuban history, are, and these 3 themes are oftentimes contradictory with each other. They are, number 1, productivity. The island's population, even from the time of colonial Spanish rule, demonstrated an enormous ability for production, for creation of wealth. Cuba was pretty much ignored as a colony by Spain, except as a seat of corruption for much of colonial rule. And yet the criollos, with very little resources, managed to turn that island into a very productive, very wealthy colony, even under Spanish rule. This ability to produce and generate wealth and to reconstruct was evident in the first Cuban Republic between 1902 and 1959. We know about the tremendous achievements of that republic in terms of economic growth and also economic inclusiveness and social inclusiveness. So, and we also see in the exile communities today, in the exile achievements, in the progress of Cuban exile economy, wherever Cuban exiles have gone, the continuity of this constant tendency in Cuban national identity to be able to organize the production of wealth. There is, however, a second recurrent theme in Cuban history, both under colonial rule, during the wars of independence, in the First Republic, and also under communist totalitarianism. And that is political violence. Cuba has been a nation periods of extreme violence throughout its history. Most often violence directed by Cubans against Cubans. And this tension, this pole of violence, the Cuban national identity is still there. It still presents itself. I think the Castro regime is the incarnation of that tendency towards violence of the of Cubans, and it's the institutionalization of this into a perpetually violent state. And I think the third theme throughout Cuba's history has been the difficulty, even under Spanish colonial rule, to establish public authority. Cubans have wrestled with the idea, with the need to create a representative public authority that can link up with the island's productivity and reduce political violence. That was the great dilemma of the Republic between 1902 and 1959. And in a sense, I think that those are still the recurrent themes of Cuban national memory is fragmented into these three things. It's fragmented into memories of productivity and wealth and sharing and abundance of spiritual values, which to me is an aspect of productivity. There's also a memory of violence, whether it's glorified or whether it's condemned. And then there is a memory of both the fact that Cubans seem to be very capable politicians, but Cubans as a people have had a recurrent challenge, a recurrent difficulty with organizing representative public authority. So those are my opening remarks.
Orlando, thank you very much for your challenging introductory remarks. And now I'm honored to invite one person who really had an opportunity to carry burden of Cuban history on his shoulders, who spent 16 years in Cuban jail. And I think his personal testimony experience really is something to be considered by all of us. So Pedro Fuentes, please step in.
My name is Pedro Fuentes. I'm a Cuban ex-political prisoner of almost 16 years. I started fighting against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, somebody that violated the Constitution of Cuba, the Constitution of 1940, and also was a candidate for the presidency. And since he knew that there was no way that he could win those elections, then what he did was to take advantage of his connections with the army, the armed forces of Cuba, to effect a coup d'etat. He did a military strike against the government of Frío Socarrás, the constitutional president of Cuba. There were going to be elections in the next few months. So he didn't let that happen. He just took over power and then started a dictatorship in Cuba that lasted for 7 years. I'm going to cut through time, so I will get to the point when first we started fighting against this regime, and then finally on January the 1st, 1959, this regime was overthrown. Batista decided by himself to leave Cuba. He just grabbed the plane and went to the Dominican Republic. There was received by Trujillo, who was another dictator, perhaps a little better than him, and much better, of course, than Fidel Castro. Anyway, the revolution started in Cuba at that day. So what happened? Fidel Castro, little by little, gained power, got to the first echelons of power, and was the one that was deciding how everything was happening there. The other fought against the Batista regime, just let him, get to that position. Anyway, he had fought in the Sierra Maestra mountains against the Batista regime. And finally, he was the one that took over power. swearing by all means that he was never gonna keep power more than 18 months. And he was not communist when he was accused of being communist. That he was not communist, of course. That he was a democratic person. They were all lies. They were all lies. Most of the people that fought against Batista for the revolution found out. And I say found out because that was one of the critical moments in the revolution, was when Uber Matos, one of the most glorified movement, decided to forego his powers. He sent a letter to Fidel Castro where he said that he was not longer wanted to be the chief of the Camagüey province, the then Camagüey province military garrison, and also of the other powers. When he did this, then Fidel Castro immediately sent Camilo Cienfuegos to Camagüey to apprehend him and also his captains. When he arrived there and he started talking to Uber Matos told me this himself in a conversation we had later on. He said that Camilo Cienfuegos started talking to him and he said, you know, I'm sorry, Uber, but Fidel Castro thinks that you have betrayed the revolution. And tell me what was going on here. And after he explained what was going on, then Uber Matos, explained to Camilo everything that had happened and all his problems with the communists there. And Camilo said, well, you know what? Fidel doesn't know about this. Let me call him. So then he grabbed the phone in Uber Matos' office. He called Fidel Castro, and he started explaining. And Fidel Castro stopped him and started screaming on the phone. He started screaming on the phone. And then he took the phone away from his ear in front of Uber to let him know that Fidel Castro was screaming and Uber could hear him. So finally, he apprehended Uber and all his captains. We found out that we had to fight against the revolution, that the revolution had been betrayed by Fidel Castro. And then we started doing that. We started doing it by setting up different centers of guerrilla warfare in the island. And let me tell you something. At the end, there were approximately, it was about 100 guerrilla warfare sites in all of the island of Cuba. So anyway, I was finally apprehended myself on the 27th of November, 1961. I was 22 years old. The state security started shooting at us, and we started shooting back. Our car was hit approximately 147 with 147 bullet hole. We weren't killed because I think the hand of God was on top of our heads. It was Alfredo Sanchez, the son of Aureliano Sanchez Arango, one of the most noted leaders of the revolution against Batista, and also against Fidel Castro. So to make a long story short, we then were apprehended because there were too many cars following us and shooting. They shot our tires out. Our car hit the Malecon Drive wall and almost got onto the ocean. And finally, we were able to they were able to get us out of the car unconscious. They put us on top of the Malecon wall there, and finally was sent to La Cabaña to be shot by firing squad. And we're not shot, and that's the reason why I'm talking to you people right now. Finally, they gave me a 60-year sentence, of which I did 16 years as a political prisoner. I don't know if I have gone beyond the time that I had allowed for this presentation. If I am telling you that I am writing my memoirs right now, some of this in the presence of the past. They are a recopilation made very sagely by Martin Palouche, Ambassador Martin Palouche, for which we thank him very much. And you can read it there when you read the book. And then later on, we'll go through other topics. But I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry if I went through my time and did more than I was allowed. It usually happens. Thank you very much.
Pedro, thank you very much. Certainly, you have not overused your time. I think your story is a really significant contribution to our collective efforts to understand better and maybe to find some new approaches how to work with collective identities of Cubans. What I hear clearly is a big dilemma, la lucha violenta o non violenta, struggle with arms in hands, with all the consequences, or non-violent struggle and the way how to open up a new path toward the future. Actually, this is one of the central questions we are trying to look at. Now, I would like to ask Maria Verlau. Maria Verlau is director of Cuban Archive. In my view, one of the greatest and most impressive project trying really to keep Cuban archive traces of Cuban history in order. And Maria Verlau has a significant capability to bring these elements into the current discussion that certainly needs to take into consideration and reflect on the past, but be oriented toward the future. So Maria, what would be your comments to what you have heard so far?
Hi, thank you, Martin, and thank you all for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I must say first that I read your essay in your fine book and have seen some of the great contributions in the volume. And I appreciate the work that your center and you have done and continue to do for Cuba. As you said, I co-founded and directed the Cuba Archive since 2001, and still direct, I'm sorry, not directed, I still do, since 2001. So it's a long time of work on the issue of memory and all the issues surrounding memory and transitional justice, because our leading project and our where we started and still continue to put most of our efforts is the Truth, Memory, and Justice Project that has had a particular focus on documenting the cost and lives of the Cuban Revolution, because those are probably the worst atrocities that have been committed, not the only ones. So I always value presentations and inputs like Pedro's just shared with us, his personal story, because that's what feeds this work. And it's a necessary grounding that we always have when we talk about issues from the ivory tower, let's say, that we need to ground it on the victims, on the people who have suffered and continue to suffer in Cuba, because this is a continuing construction of memory of the violence that has been perpetrated against the nation. So our approach has mainly been to, in the issue, to put it in the terms of truth recovery and truth telling. So we're doing a registry documenting systematically and comprehensively as much as possible with minimal resources, the cost and lives of this process. But also putting that in action. So it's a way that I would call of constructive remembering, and to do several things. First, to help get rid of the system of violence, a continuing dictatorship in Cuba, and bring about a democratic and peaceful transition. And secondly, to prepare Cuban society for a transition that hopefully will be peaceful and democratic and lead to a stable society by raising awareness and capacity of the practices and principles of transitional justice. So I think what we try to do is we balance the philosophical, ethical, moral aspects of this constructing remembering with the practical aspects of how do we bring about that transition? How do we push to get rid of the system that continues to perpetrate repression and violence of the Cuban people? But this constructive remembering, we approach it, and it's, I think, really important to clarify from the perspective not of revenge, but from the perspective of creating a culture of respect for life, for human rights, for the rule of law, for justice, with the objective of creating a better society today, bringing it about, but also averting further atrocities. Because as Orlando pointed out, the history of Cuba, we always need to refer to the history and the idiosyncrasies of a nation. I think we're all different. I've lived in different countries and had the opportunities, for example, to witness in person the transition in Chile, where I lived for 7 years during the Pinochet regime and then the transitional process. And I think all of those things are what we're trying to bring to the Cuba issue in a way that is a contribution, not a setback, to bring about a better future. And I want to just remark that a Cuban issue, we always have to remember there's unique challenges and perspectives for Cuba. And one is people need to remember that we have 68 years of dictatorships. So we're talking about the Cuban Revolution is a process that comes about after what Pedro well described, the Batista dictatorship. So since 1952, Cuba has not had a democracy. And Cuba only had 50 years, let's say, of Republican life and independence, and was constructing a very prosperous democracy with problems that needed to be addressed, but always within the rule of law. And in the Cuban component, I think there's another factor that needs to be taken into account, and it's that it's not just domestic, that there are great international implications, because the Cuban regime, since its start, Fidel Castro was embarked on expanding the revolutionary model, exporting the revolution, and has intervened in many countries for decades, this regime, including today, as we know, in Venezuela. So I think those components present interesting challenges that merit the whole idea of memory and how we deal with memory and constructive remembering. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. And now Miguel Cosio, who is journalist, who is CEO of American TV station. So he is perceiving the situation rather from, I would say, a rather present perspective and not the past only. But it seems to me that there is, in general sense, change of generations, new generations coming, not so much connected with the past as their parents and grandparents. I know that there is a now big movie being prepared plant, just to put that story into a certain context. So can you give us your observations and comments on this discussion we are having right now?
Yo quiero hoy hablar del pasado, pero voy a empezar por el presente y como vengo del mundo de los medios de comunicación, quiero partir de un ejemplo muy concreto que estamos viviendo para hacer una reflexión al final un poco más profunda, si es que cabe el término. Todos los seres humanos que vivimos en este planeta desde hace poco más de 3 meses estamos experimentando una vivencia inédita, por lo menos para nosotros, que es el tema de la pandemia del coronavirus. Por lo tanto, yo quiero comenzar el tema que nos atrae en el día de hoy, que es la influencia del pasado en el presente, por cómo se está viviendo la pandemia del coronavirus en Cuba y qué relación tiene las expresiones sociales que estamos viendo con el pasado. Si les parece bien, pues por ahí comenzaré. En este tema de cómo se está viviendo de la pandemia del coronavirus, y tanto María como Orlando, que son, yo lo diría, sociólogos de la cabeza a los pies, lo pueden ver de esta forma. En esta vivencia extrema que está viviendo el pueblo de Cuba con la pandemia, estamos viendo un fenómeno que yo diría que se podría calificar perfectamente en la heurística de las afectividades. Es decir, lo que estamos viendo es que el pueblo cubano, ante el temor, ante el pavor y ante el evento del coronavirus, pues ha decidido tomar decisiones sin reflexionarlo mucho. La gente, más allá de lo que el gobierno, el régimen castrista, el régimen cubano ha impuesto, la gente la hemos visto en las imágenes lanzándose a la calle a poder tomar los pocos productos que le llegan. Hemos visto las colas desafiando la distancia social, que es el nuevo término que se ha implantado ahora. Es decir, si nos escuchara el doctor Marshall McLuhan, que hablaba de la aldea global, hemos pasado de la aldea global al distanciamiento social. Y la gente en Cuba ha desafiado la distancia social y ha desafiado todo con tal de buscar la comida. Es decir, cuando el ser humano trata de protegerse, incluso trata de enclaustrarse, de alejarse de la realidad circundante para vivir, el pueblo cubano ha salido a tratar de buscar la comida, un ejemplo primario de lo que vive. ¿Y a qué se debe esto? El régimen cubano en 61 años, y ahora Pedro estaba recordando el inicio de la trágica historia que ha vivido el pueblo cubano en este lapso de tiempo, le ha dado impuesta una realidad inaudita. Y esta experiencia que ha vivido el pueblo, que está viviendo el pueblo cubano ahora, la vimos cuando el periodo especial, que de especial no tuvo nada en los años 90, es decir, el pueblo cubano lleva viviendo 61 años, una heurística de las afecciones trágicas. El pasado se nos ha impuesto al presente. Entonces, cuando algún día podamos ver nuestra patria libre, donde haya elecciones libres, donde la democracia, con todas las imperfecciones que tenga, se imponga, lo primero que tenemos que romper, y lo que yo creo que en este momento, y lo he conversado mucho con Orlando en los últimos 2 años, lo que yo creo que hay que romper es el peso del pasado en el presente. Es decir, los cubanos podemos hacer muchas cosas desde dentro de Cuba, podemos hacer muchas cosas desde fuera de Cuba para cambiar esa realidad trágica, pero una de las cosas que tenemos que romper es el peso del pasado. El gobierno cubano al principio de la pandemia está invitando al mundo entero a que fuera a hacer turismo a Cuba. Es decir, estaba lejano de la realidad. Y veíamos al ministro del turismo, veíamos al nuevo primer ministro, que fue el ministro de turismo de más larga data quizás en la historia contemporánea. Veíamos al propio Díaz-Canel invitando a la gente que fuera a Cuba porque Cuba supuestamente era un lugar seguro del coronavirus. La realidad le impuso otra cosa. Incluso Mucho tiempo después que arrancó la pandemia del coronavirus, el régimen cubano seguía con el tema de las clases. Hay una foto por ahí que es increíble de los niños en la escuela, en lugar de con los famosos tapabocas, con la mano puesta en la cara. Entonces, el régimen cubano, que vive una irrealidad, pero desgraciadamente para nuestro pueblo se ha hecho una realidad trágica en 61 años, sigue imponiendo el peso del pasado que diseñó y nos está impactando hoy todavía. Hoy más que nunca, nuestra nación podría estar más cerca de la libertad. Hay un conjunto de medidas importantes que desde hacía mucho tiempo había que tomar y finalmente el gobierno actual de los Estados Unidos tomó. Hemos impuesto más sanciones al régimen y en este momento el régimen cubano está más débil que nunca. No tienen un liderazgo claro, no tienen ni a la figura de Fidel Castro, esa de la que hablaba Pedro hace un momento, no tienen ni siquiera un liderazgo con Raúl Castro, nunca lo ha tenido porque es un hombre gris, carente de ideas, y mucho menos con los herederos estos que nos quieren imponer. Lo que hay que evitar para el futuro de Cuba y para el presente es que ese pasado, donde imponían incluso el estilo de la política, sea el futuro. Nosotros tendríamos que acabar, nos quieren imponer y que ya no dicen ellos que la ideología sería la misma pero transformada, como la historia del gato pardo, que todo cambie para que todo quede igual y nada cambie. A lo que voy, esta pandemia que el gobierno cubano le ha impuesto en 61 años al pueblo de Cuba, hoy más que nunca una de las cosas que tendríamos que tratar de cambiar es el peso del pasado en el presente y en el futuro de Cuba. Muchas gracias, Martín, y muchas gracias a mis colegas.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for this contribution. I think that sounds maybe a provocative idea just to put pandemic situation into the context of history. What I would say is that there are certain narratives here, narratives that are very deeply present. I can imagine that all children going to school in Cuba are having certain, I would say, almost brainwashing on their daily program to find themselves in the context of this story. And I think that the time is to make wiser decisions collectively, to really help Cuban people to discuss openly narratives of the past and find some way to better future. I read with great interest Orlando's observation that Cuba actually was an interesting case in connection of, I would say, Latin American context. That Cuba was a country that certainly had a very specific relationship with presence in Cuba, starting in the beginning of or in the last years of the 19th century. And obviously, Jose Marti is a great example of that question, that situation. And we have narratives being presented here by people living in exile. We have narratives being brought into discussion by courageous Cuban dissidents who are trying to look for a way the past from the status quo for to some better future. So I have now a question to all of you who are here. How can history, reflections on history, help us, not maybe offer us a great theme for our academic discussions in our ivory towers, but to be turned into action, to be turned into something that can inspire people like Pedro Fuentes-Sit. I still would like to ask him. He felt that Cuban revolution was betrayed. I understand the point. I agree with that. But I would like to ask you, so what was the basic objective of that revolution that was betrayed? What is still the objective of Cuban revolution in the beginning of, or in the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century? it is something different from what inspired you a long time ago and brought you into a situation in which you had to show a lot of bravery in jail and certainly be even facing the possible death being executed by a firing squad Paredon situation. So whoever wants to step in, please comment on your own contributions among yourselves, and I will certainly step in if I feel that I can say something too.
First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to this panel because I've learned a lot so far. And it's been a pleasure to listen to Maria. I'm a big fan of her work. To Pedro, whom I admire a great deal, and to Miguel Cosillo, who's a very intelligent guy, very, very sharp. And I think he said something that I want to build upon. He said that the key, the essence of moving forward with a democratic transformation of Cuba is rompiendo el peso del pasado en el presente. Every totalitarian regime tries to do that. It tries to petrify the present, to control the present by living off a past that it itself has created. Let's remember Orwell's famous dictum that he who controls the past controls the present, he who controls the present controls the future. So the Castro regime has wanted Cubans to remain in that first week of 1959, in those first 2 weeks, forever, because those were the 2 weeks that were essential in consolidating his hold in power. Now, how do we break the presence of the past in our present? I think that there's a real awareness in everyone, even in those within the regime who belong to a new generation, that you have to break that hold of the past and the present, because it has degraded Cuba, and it has sent Cuba into a path of self-destruction, which is terrible. We're the only Latin American country with a negative birth rate. We're the Latin American country with the highest suicide rate. We're the Latin American country with the greatest number of political prisoners per capita. I can go on listing these horrible things, which give me no pleasure in listing. But I think we have to talk about how do we approach what Miguel has said. And I think Miguel, knowing Miguel and speaking with him, I think he's thinking fundamentally of the Mexican transition. The Mexican transition from PRI, authoritarian control, to a democracy. A transition which I think is being reversed right now, sadly enough. But I think a big part of the Mexican transition to democracy was breaking with that hold of the past and the present. The PRI wanted the Mexican people to remain, in that landscape of the Mexican Revolution and the peasants taking up arms and defeating the imperialists and the landowners and creating a new Mexico, so that Mexicans wouldn't look at the corruption of the regime, at its inefficiencies, at its corrosive nature of Mexican society. And I think a major event that helped destroy that PRI control over the present through the past was the Mexican earthquake of 1985. That earthquake showed how incapable the regime was, and how indispensable Mexican civil society was to the well-being of Mexicans. I think the pandemic in Cuba is having and is going to have a similar effect. People have seen not just how oppressive this regime is, but how inept it is and how useless it is. And I think a perfect depiction of that is the fact that while Cuba is facing this terrible threat, and while the official numbers certainly don't jive with the reality on the ground, what the regime has been dedicated to has been imprisoning independent farmers because they won't sell their products to the state. That's been their focus of the arrest and the repression. We've seen that dozens of arrests in Havana province because people weren't selling onions. How much more backward can that be? And how much more destructive of Cuba's possibilities? So to sum up my comments, I think we need to develop a strategy to break the hold of that past in the present. I don't think that it lies in demystifying Cuban history, in destroying the foundational myths of Cuban history. I think that's a mistake, because a lot of those myths are real. And you don't get anything by destroying Jose Marti or trying to destroy the legacy of Jose Marti, like many do in opposition to the regime. I think we have to reorient Cuban history. How we look at Cuban history has to shift its focus from the glorification of force and strength and violence to appraising our real productive goals as a people, what Cuba has achieved traditionally in its economy, what Cuba has achieved traditionally in its music, its art, its literature, and yes, what Cuba has achieved when it pursues law. Maria was talking about a new culture of law and of respect for human rights. That is so true, because another recurrent thing in our history is that we don't respect the law. And it's true, Cubans don't have what Ivan Ilyin called the consciousness of law. We've gotten it in the United States. I think it's been very important, but our culture has lacked that. And it's been downhill, because I think during the wars of independence, there was a great more respect for law than there is now. So we've been losing that awareness, that consciousness of law. So I think that number one thing is to reorient what we value in Cuban history, what we study in Cuban history, and what through political action we glorify in Cuban history. And I think the second thing that we have to break with is this idea of the Castro Revolution as the central component of Cuban history. That is not true. I mean, it's an island with over 500 years of history since the arrival of the Spanish. In Cuba, go back all the way to the prehistorical period. There is an abundance of Cuban history over and beyond what the Communist Revolution is. And there we have a lot in common with Czech Republic, with Poland, even with Russia. That these countries have successfully gone back into the wealth of their history. Like Havel said, now with the end of the Cold War, we can go back into history again. And we can see which is the reality of the Cuban soul. Not this idea pushed forth by Castro that the Cuban soul had been finished or completed or built as a result of the taking of power that he led. I know that these remarks of mine are a little bit ambiguous right now, but definitely this seminar has set me thinking about certain steps we need to take, and I think this is a general direction which I would like to work in.
I'm muted. Great. I don't want to be just delegating the thing, but what Orlando just said, I need to ask Maria. Maria, you have introduced a very important concept, transitional justice. You also mentioned that there might be some uses or inspiration from other countries. How to do it, I can certainly offer to Cuban consideration our Czech case and admit that we have not been 100% successful, that obviously encounters with the past can generate a lot of troubles, but still experience is experience, and others also have the opportunity to learn from it. So can you tell us something about your vision, how transitional justice and memories that are stored not only in archive, but made living entities through the people who were going through these histories. How do you see it?
Yes, thank you for that, because that's going to be my comment. I wanted to respond to Miguel and to your challenging question. How do you overcome the past in a way that makes sense for today? Because again, I think the intellectual debates on the whole issue of memory, the nation, and the history, very important to be grounded on that. However, we need to be practical, because as Miguel well pointed out, the situation in Cuba is desperate, and people have had enough of 61 years of speeches, etc., and they just want to live a better life in Cuba, and they deserve to do that. So I think one of our biggest challenges is to dispel the myths, so that the people affected by propaganda and disinformation for all these years can see credible facts to inform themselves about what is the nature of, their situation and where they can go. So the question on transitional justice is really important, because I think that by raising awareness and capacity on transitional justice issues, which is the whole wealth of knowledge that has been built in the last, let's say, 40, 50 years in many processes of countries that move from political violence and authoritarianism to democratic and open societies with imperfections, okay, but there's many processes that I think that is very real to people, and that they can also feel that if others did it, we can do it too. And what does that translate into? It's not remember, how do we establish the truth, etc. But it's very pragmatical things like, what do we do with the archives of the state security? How do we save them? How do we process them? How do we make them available to the population? What is lustration? In other words, what echelons of the Communist Party or the repressors should be prevented from participating in the political life, and for how long? How do we transform the huge and gigantic security apparatus into the intelligence and security services of an open and democratic society? How do we promote social reconciliation to avoid atrocities, to cement the rule of law? And how do we deal with justice? These are only a few of the many questions that we can learn from the experiences, not just of the Czech Republic, of the former East Germany, etc. But there's many that are sort of more culturally similar to Cuba in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Peru, etc. So there's a wealth of opportunities for us to bring that capacity to the Cuban people so that not just they prepare for a transition, but that it helps fuel that transition, because that's what we need the most. We need this regime to end and for that process to begin.
Now, Pedro, my dear friend, you already made your case, and my question to you now is, can I imagine, let's say, students in primary school or in all levels of education in future Cuba reading in their history textbooks about who they are collectively as Cubans. And your story certainly should be part of it. I think that story of your generation, of people who were seeing the world in their own perspective, and then they had to observe the times changing over the decades, but still with your story and with your memory of friends who might been killed by firing squads, and you still are in some sort of silent partnership with them. So what is your vision of the future? What are you going to do with your story?
This is a very interesting point. Thank you very much for bringing it out. I have right now a couple of things to bring out. I had the opportunity, thanks to you, when I met President Václav Havel, I had the opportunity to travel to meet other revolutions against communism, which happened in Hungary with Arpad Gans. Thanks to Václav Havel, I traveled there, and thanks to Václav Mali, who also was a proverbial in bringing me to all these places, and also to Poland. When I went there, I was looking to learn the history of how communism disappeared in all these countries, which, by the way, right now they're like one of the most countries, the richest countries in Europe. Definitely. Anyway, so my proposal right now is that we do like a manual, like we get together with the people of Poland, Hungary, and Romania, our friends from Romania, to do some kind of manual of modus operandi, to say it correctly in Latin, modus operandi for things that could happen in Cuba, for example, or other communist countries. But right now, Cuba, which is my country, is my main worry. If we do that, we will have a way to know what to do on each situation that arises when anything happens, because you guys had the experience. I mean, your first steps with the Communist Party, with the people in the Communist Party that were more prone to changes than others. In every Communist Party, there are people that are more conservative and people that are not so conservative. In Cuba, that is the case also. So if we can get a meeting of all these people from all these countries, at least one from each one of these countries, to get together with us, I will guarantee my help to write a modus operandi of how to confront communism, what to do. I know that things will be different in every place. So even so, the main topics, when they arise, that they would have an answer, the proper answer from us to deal with. I think that would be very important. And the second point that I wanted to touch very briefly is the point of the COVID-19 in Cuba. The COVID-19 in Cuba is Cuba is possibly the worst scenario for the COVID-19. A lot of families live in the same dwelling. So if one of them falls sick, they will all be exposed to the germ, to the virus. Also, people have by force to be in long lines. People don't have even they don't have the money for the mask. A lot of people don't even wear the mask. Others wear it, but anyway, it's the worst scenario for the COVID-19. The situation in Cuba right now is one of the worst. It's the worst situation that Cuba has had economically in its history. So, according to Carmelo Mesa Lago, one of the most famous economists that has dedicated a big part of his life to study the Cuban economy, and he says that the Cuban economy is reaching a climax of destruction. The money that the Cubans were getting from Venezuela is no longer coming in. So we are near the end of the Cuban Revolution. So we are in need of this modus operandi manual more than ever. Thank you, and I'm sorry if I again went over my time limits. Thank you. And it was a pleasure, really, and an honor to be here
Pedro,
with you all.
I just don't want to correct your, Pedro, I don't want to correct your statement, but you said it is the end of the Cuban Revolution. I hope that it is the beginning or a return to your concept of Cuban Revolution. You decided to fight
that's a very good point. I was talking about that we fought for not only for human rights, but also for a lot of reforms that are now in Cuba that we want to keep in the
okay.
We want to keep free education. We want to keep free health. We want to keep that in Cuba in the future. Yes,
okay,
definitely.
Okay. Now, I think time has come to final comments of the last three participants in this panel. So, Miguel, you go first.
Ok, thank you, Martin. Rápido. Tomo dos ideas que manejaron tanto María como Orlando. Orlando ponía el ejemplo, pasa en la realidad mexicana. México, que quizás fue el único país, por lo menos que yo conozco, que institucionalizó la revolución. Se llamaba Partido Revolucionario Institucional. Es decir, convirtió la revolución en un hecho institucional, y yo creo que de ahí, tanto los modelos soviéticos y de los países satélites que existieron durante la Guerra Fría, como todas las demás naciones que tomaron ese camino, a excepción de China, institucionalizaron de alguna u otra forma la revolución. Lo que ha pasado en la historia de México, lo sabemos. La corrupción acabó con la finalización de un larguísimo proceso de transición a la democracia, y lo que estamos viendo hoy es que quizás, como planteaba Orlando, tengamos un retroceso. ¿Por qué lo traigo? Porque el modelo de sociedad y la estructura política y administrativa que se establezca en la Cuba del futuro tiene que dejar no solo nuestro pasado, sino el pasado de las influencias políticas que hubo tanto en el siglo XX como en el siglo XXI. Tiene que marginarse de ese camino. El otro punto que señalaba María era las grandes preguntas que nos tenemos que hacer. ¿Cómo ser prácticos en la circunstancia actual y cómo a la vez, de una vez y por todas, reformar las instituciones que todavía en un principio de la transición van a existir? El aparato represivo, el aparato de los servicios de inteligencia, las estructuras económicas, incluso las estructuras legales que aún van a persistir. Es decir, el pasado, incluso en el primer momento de la transición cubana, que estoy seguro que todos los presentes vamos a vivir, va todavía a acarrear cosas del pasado. Entonces, ¿cuál será la tarea para acelerar ese proceso de dejar atrás el pasado? Y no solo eso, sino de no cometer errores que puedan llevarnos a una regresión hacia el pasado, como Orlando lo acaba de decir en el caso mexicano, que es lo que estamos viendo. Y en este punto, lo último, Martín, para concluir mi intervención, es que el único país, y hay que decirlo con todas las letras, que ha estado desde el primer momento en el proceso de que Cuba regrese a un entorno de libertad y democracia, se llama los Estados Unidos. Muchos países, incluyendo la República Checa, después de su proceso de transición hacia la democracia, de la larga democracia que vivió la República Checa, también se han sumado a ese esfuerzo. Pero una de las cosas que nosotros tenemos que observar, y estamos a punto de verlo ahora, el 3 de noviembre, en las elecciones de los Estados Unidos, es ver cómo no se regresa incluso a las políticas que hubo desde los gobiernos norteamericanos hacia Cuba, que impidan que la transición se haga efectiva. El gobierno actual de los Estados Unidos ha tomado medidas y muy serias, y ojalá se sigan insistiendo en ello. Por eso yo creo que lo que pase el 3 de noviembre incluso va a tener un significado en lo que se puede hacer. Muchas gracias de nuevo.
Muchas gracias. Now, and please be brief, Orlando and then Maria. Orlando.
Every revolution, and I welcome that concept of Pedro Fuentes, going back to the original ideals of the Cuban Revolution, to build a democracy, to build rule of law. But every revolution generates a type of individual, and that type of individual also reinforces that revolution. When it's a totalitarian process like Cuba has lived, the Castro regime has generated a type of individual that obeys without questioning, and whose only truth is what Fidel Castro says, and who lives more in the past of what Fidel Castro said was the past than in the present of his reality. I think our great struggle is to conceive of that new Cuban that thinks in democracy, that thinks in freedom, that advocates for both, and that can therefore both successfully triumph in building democracy and live in that democracy. And I think of Oswaldo Payá and how he spoke about this new kind of Cuban, this Cuban who would be able to forge freedom in order to live in freedom. I think the great challenge lies there, and I think it requires a great deal of thought and a great deal of action to generate that type of individual.
Maria?
Yes, thank you again for the opportunity. And I want to end maybe with a more philosophical comment. That is something that follows me a lot in this work. And it's the constant battle of the balance between virtue and the realities of, let's say, the worst aspects of human nature. Because I mean, I moved to this work through love. I mean, I think the solution is very simple for a society: to love each other and to have compassion. Then we would avoid all the ills of the world, or many of the ills in the world. But we have to be very realistic of what is possible. In the Cuban case, I think it takes a very important dose of self-reflection, not just of, you know, our own devils and lower aspects of our nature, but that within the idiosyncrasy and the history of the Cuban nation. And I think that's a challenge. I'm an idealist, so I believe that the challenge, we should seize it to move forward, and that we can. But it's important that we be pragmatic about it, and that we address it, and that it's also important to not just listen with respect to those we agree with, but to listen to those that have opposite views, that we consider adversaries or enemies. Because if one thing this communist or Castroist regime, however you want to call it, that exists in Cuba has done very successfully, is plant hatred and division in the Cuban people. So we need to overcome that, find a way to overcome that.
First of all, thank all of you for participation in this great debate. And I would like to end up with the Václav Havel's slogan used once at a public demonstration in Prague in November of 1989, for which he was criticized later, and still some people in the Czech Republic like to use this in sort of a derogative way. And Václav Havel said that truth and love will prevail over lies and hatred. And I think that this is something what is in my ears now listening to all of you. The truth is not only something what we have in possession. Truth is not our possession. Truth is truth. Truth is something we need to respect and search for it, and not just to try to monopolize it. This was the Fidel Castro's intention. And love versus hatred. I think hatred doesn't make you think well creatively enough. Hatred just brings you to wrong conclusions. Love makes a chance for justice and also reconciliation, that the past can be overcome with something better than keeping the past alive and feeling with hatred. So I think that with this message, I would like to end this beautiful conversation. This conversation is a common cooperation of Václav Havel program for human rights and diplomacy at Florida International University and Inspire America Foundation. Inspire America Foundation is really inspirational. And Miguel Ocio is certainly one of those who are here just to represent that entity. So thank to all of you, and looking forward to see you in a next opportunity, because there are still many things we want and need to talk about. Thank you very much.